The Arizona desert stretched like a canvas of scorched earth. Its reds and golds burned raw under a relentless sun. Jake Callahan's boots crunched against the brittle ground, each step a quiet rebellion against the silence that had claimed his life. His ranch perched on the canyon's lip, a weathered outpost of wood and stone, defiant against the vast emptiness. The wind howled through the chasms, carrying whispers of sage and dust, a language Jake understood better than words. His hands, calloused and cracked like the desert itself, gripped the reins of his horse, a dun mare named Sage, who moved with the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. Jake's life was a rhythm too unyielding, solitary, deliberate. Sunrise bled into the sky, and he was up, feeding the horses, checking the fences, riding the boundaries of his land. The cattle didn't care about his past, and the land didn't judge. Years ago, a fire had stolen his wife, Clara, and their son, Eli, leaving only ash and a hollow man. Since then, Jake had built walls of routine, his days as predictable as the sun's arc. At night, he'd sit on the porch, a tin cup of black coffee cooling in his hands, watching the horizon swallow the light. His face, lined like the canyon walls, held no trace of the man who once laughed easily. His gray eyes, sharp as flint, saw everything but invited nothing. He didn't go into town unless the pantry ran dry. When he did, his hat stayed low, his words scarce. The townsfolk called him the quiet cowboy, a title that suited him fine. They didn't know the weight of his silence, how it was both shield and scar. Jake preferred it that way. The desert didn't ask questions, and neither did he. But on an August evening, when the air hung heavy with heat and the sky burned violet, something broke the rhythm. Jake was riding the south ridge, Sage's hooves kicking up clouds of dust, when a sound cut through the wind's low moan. It was faint, fragile, like the cry of a wounded creature. He reined in, head cocked, listening. The sound came again, a whimper, human, desperate. His pulse quickened, a rare disturbance in his steady world. He nudged Sage toward the noise, through a tangle of mesquite and creosote, into the shadow of the canyon's brush. There, beneath a gnarled mesquite tree, lay a young woman. She was curled on her side, one hand clutching a swollen ankle, the other gripping the earth as if it might anchor her. Her clothes, once a simple dress, were torn, the fabric stained with sweat and dust. Her long black hair, tangled with twigs and brittle leaves, spilled across her face like a veil. Her skin, bronzed by the sun, was marred with scratches, each one a map of her struggle. Her eyes, dark and wide, locked onto Jake's, and for a moment the world held its breath. Fear flickered in her gaze, but beneath it, something fiercer burned, defiance, raw and unyielding. Jake dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, hands raised to show he meant no harm. His boots sank into the dry earth, the crunch of gravel loud in the stillness. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough, rusted from years of disuse. She didn't answer, her lips pressed tight, her body tense as a coiled spring. He saw the way her chest rose and fell, shallow and quick, like a bird caught in a snare. He knelt beside her, keeping his distance, and offered his canteen. The metal was warm from the sun, its surface dented from years of use. She hesitated, her fingers trembling as they reached for it. When the water touched her lips, they quivered, and a faint sound, half sigh, half sob, escaped her. Jake studied her ankle, swollen and bruised, the skin stretched tight over the bone. "Can you walk?" he asked. She tried to move, her face twisting in pain, and shook her head. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. Jake could tell. He didn't ask more. Questions could wait. He slid one arm under her shoulders, the other beneath her knees, and lifted her with a gentleness that surprised even him. She was light, fragile as a desert flower, but there was a strength in her frame, a resilience that matched the land itself. He settled her on Sage, holding her steady as he walked the horse back to the ranch, the canyon's shadows lengthening. Around them, at the cabin, Jake laid her on the sagging couch, its faded plaid worn thin by time. The room smelled of pine and leather, the air thick with the day's heat. He wasn't a doctor, but he'd patched enough wounds his own. The horses, the cattle's, to know the basics. He cleaned her scratches with water and a clean cloth, the fabric staining red as he worked. Her ankle needed rest, not a splint, so he wrapped it tightly, his fingers careful but sure. He smeared a dab of herbal salve made from desert plants, something he'd learned from an old ranch hand over the worst of her cuts. She winced but didn't pull away. her eyes tracking his every move. Jake set a plate of beans and cornbread beside her, the food simple but warm. He didn't linger. He stepped outside, giving her space, the porch creaking under his weight. The desert night was alive with sounds: crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of wind through the brush. He sipped his coffee, its bitterness grounding him, and stared at the stars. They were sharp tonight, like pinpricks in a velvet sky. Hours later, her voice broke the silence. "My name is Naya," she said, soft but clear, her accent carrying the cadence of the canyon's people. Jake turned, his silhouette framed against the moonlit desert. "Jake," he replied, his voice steady but quieter than he meant. She nodded, and the silence returned. But it was different now. It wasn't empty. It was a thread, fragile but real, stretching between them. Over the next few days, Naya healed slowly. She moved with care, her limp easing as the swelling in her ankle faded. She was quiet, but her presence filled the cabin. She touched nothing without purpose, her fingers brushing the wooden table, the iron stove, as if memorizing their texture. She watched Jake, not with suspicion, but with a curiosity that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. She cooked with wild herbs she found near the ranch: sage, yucca, mesquite pods, her hands deft as she ground them into pastes or steeped them in boiling water. The cabin smelled of earth and spice, and Jake ate better than he had since Clara's kitchen went cold. He learned bits of her story, not from questions but from what she let slip. She was Apache, from a village deep in the canyon, a place hidden from the world's greed. Men had come, strangers with rifles and cruel eyes. They'd taken her, part of a raid disguised as relocation. She'd escaped under cover of night, running through the desert, her bare feet bloodied, her heart pounding with the will to survive. She didn't say more, and Jake didn't push. Her silence was her armor, and he respected it. But something in him stirred. Every time he saw her grinding herbs in a stone bowl, her hair catching the golden light of dusk, or sitting on the porch, her eyes scanning the horizon, he felt a warmth he'd thought long dead. It wasn't just her beauty, though she had that in spades, with her sharp cheekbones and eyes that held both fire and shadow. It was her strength, the way she carried her pain without letting it define her. She was like the desert itself, fierce, fragile, enduring. One morning, Jake found tracks near the north fence, deep, deliberate, too clean to be his own. He crouched, his fingers brushing the earth, reading the story they told. These weren't rancher boots. They were heavy, purposeful, like those of men who hunted for a living. His jaw tightened, his instincts humming like a taut wire. He didn't tell Naya, but that night he oiled his rifle, the metal gleaming in the lantern light, and set it beside the door. The familiar weight of it grounded him, but it couldn't quiet the unease coiling in his gut. The next day, while Naya was inside crushing mesquite pods, her hands stained with their sweetness, Jake rode the boundary again. More tracks, fresher this time, leading toward the canyon's edge. Someone was circling, searching. He returned to the ranch, his face unreadable but his eyes sharp. Naya was on the porch, a clay mug in her hands, her gaze fixed on the distant rocks. She glanced at the rifle leaning against the wall. "You saw them," she said. Not a question. Jake nodded. "They're close." She didn't answer directly. Her eyes, dark as the night sky, traced the horizon. "They will come," she said, her voice low, steady. "They always do." Jake felt a chill, not from the desert's cooling air but from the weight of her words. He'd lived through loss, through fire and grief, but this was different. This wasn't just about his land anymore. It was about her, about the thread between them, growing stronger with every shared silence. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the porch, the rifle across his lap, the stars his only company. Every rustle of brush, every snap of a twig, made his hand twitch toward the trigger. At some point, Naya came out, a wool blanket draped over her shoulders. She didn't speak, just sat beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. She pulled the blanket over them both, her arm brushing his, and leaned lightly against his shoulder. Her touch was soft but electric, a spark in the quiet dark. For a man who'd lived in silence, it was louder than a storm. Jake's heart, long buried under ash, stirred. He realized, with a clarity that scared him, that he was falling for her. But the desert was a harsh teacher. It never gave without taking, and Jake feared the price for Naya's safety might be more than he could bear. The morning dawned cold, the sun sluggish behind a veil of clouds. Jake stood at the edge of the porch, his breath visible in the crisp air, his eyes scanning the horizon. His rifle was loaded, Sage saddled and ready. Something in his bones told him today was the day. The men hunting Naya would come. Behind him, the door creaked. Naya stepped out, the blanket wrapped tight around her, her ankles still tender but her posture unyielding. Her eyes met his, and he saw it, the same certainty, the same quiet dread. "I can go," she said, her voice soft but firm. "If I leave, they won't hurt you." Jake's jaw tightened, his hand clenching the porch rail. "This is my land," he said. "They come here, they answer to me, but I brought danger to your home. You brought life back to it," he countered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, they stood there, the silence between them heavy with unspoken truths. Then Jake reached out, his rough fingers brushing hers. "I've lost everything once. I'm not losing you." Just before noon, they came. For riders crested the ridge, their coats dusted with red earth, hats pulled low, guns glinting at their hips. They rode with the arrogance of men who knew fear followed them. Jake stood in front of the cabin, his rifle resting easy in his hands, his stance as solid as the canyon walls. The lead rider, a tall man with a scar slicing his cheek, dismounted and stepped forward. His boots left deep prints in the dirt, a claim on the land that wasn't his. "You, Callahan?" the man asked, his voice smooth but edged with menace. Jake nodded, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "We're looking for an Apache girl, escaped from a government transport, property of the state." He unfolded a crumpled paper, holding it out like it meant something. Jake didn't glance at it. "Haven't seen anyone," Jake said, his voice calm. Final. The scarred man squinted, his lips curling into a smirk. "You sure about that? We got word she's here. You really want to die for some runaway?" "This is my land," Jake said, his tone flat but unyielding. "You're trespassing." The air grew taut, the other riders shifting in their saddles, hands hovering near their guns. The scarred man took a step closer, his boots grinding the dirt. "She's government property. We're just doing our job." Before Jake could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "She's not going anywhere." Naya stood in the doorway, her frame small but unyielding, her hair whipping in the wind. Her eyes burned with a fire that made the scarred man pause. "There she is," he said, his grin widening, proprietary, like she was a prize to be claimed. Jake moved faster than thought, his rifle snapping up, the barrel steady. A shot rang out, dust exploding at the scarred man's feet. Jake hadn't missed heed, warned. "Next one goes through your chest," he growled. The other men dismounted, hands on their weapons, but Jake didn't flinch. He was a rock in a storm, his gaze locked on the scarred man. Naya stepped forward, her limp barely noticeable, her voice steady. "I'll go," she said. "No more blood." Jake's head whipped toward her, his heart pounding. "No," he said, his voice raw. "You don't have to do this." "I won't let them break what I found here," she said, her eyes holding his. "Not you." She turned to the scarred man. "If I come, you leave him alone." The man's smirk returned. "Fine by me." Jake's blood roared in his ears. He raised his rifle again, his voice low, deadly. "She's not going. She's under my protection. You want her, you go through me." The scarred man's eyes narrowed, weighing Jake's resolve. "You ready to die for her?" "I'm ready to kill for her," Jake said, and the desert itself seemed to hold its breath. The other men hesitated, their confidence wavering. They were mercenaries, not soldiers paid to hunt, not to die. The scarred man's smirk faded, his hand twitching toward his gun but stopping short. "Not worth the trouble," he muttered, stepping back. "Let's ride." They turned, their horses kicking up dust as they retreated, a storm fading into the distance. Jake didn't lower his rifle until they were gone, his hands shaking not from fear but from the weight of what he'd almost lost. Naya stood beside him, silent tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Her eyes held something stronger than gratitude, something that looked like love. That evening, they sat on the porch, the desert painted in hues of pink and gold. "No danger, no more running," Naya whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I never thought I'd feel safe again." Jake took her hand, his rough fingers gentle against her skin. "You gave me something, too." "What?" He looked at the horizon, the light softening the hard lines of his face. "A reason to feel alive again." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, the weight of it steady, sure. The ranch no longer felt like a tomb. The silence wasn't heavy, it was peace. In the weeks that followed, Naya stayed, her ankle healed, and she began planting herbs behind the cabin: sage, yucca, desert, lavender. She taught Jake their secrets: how to brew teas that soothed the body and soul, how to read the star stories in the night sky. He taught her to mend fences, to ride sage without fear, to aim a rifle with precision. They didn't speak of love, but it was there, in the way he watched her move through the cabin, in the way she waited for him each evening, her silhouette framed against the sunset. One night, under a moon so bright it rivaled the sun, Naya asked, "Do you ever wish things were different, that you hadn't lost what you had?" Jake thought for a long moment, his eyes tracing the desert's endless expanse. "No," he said softly, "because if I hadn't lost it, I wouldn't have found you." Her smile was a quiet bloom, tears glinting in her eyes. The desert, harsh and unyielding, had given them something rare: a love forged in adversity, a life reclaimed from the ashes. And as they sat together, the wind singing its ancient song, Jake Callahan knew he'd fight for it, for her, for as long as the canyon stood. The desert awoke with a whisper of wind, stirring the dust like forgotten memories. Jake Callahan rose before the sun, his body attuned to the rhythm of the land, muscles aching from the previous day's labors. The cabin creaked under the first light, its wooden beams expanding with the warmth. He glanced at the couch where Naya slept, her form curled under the wool blanket, her breathing steady and soft. Her hair spilled across the pillow like ink on parchment, and for a moment Jake allowed himself to watch the rise and fall of her chest, the faint scars on her hands from thorns and escapes. She looked peaceful, but he knew better. The desert didn't grant peace without a fight. He stepped outside, the cool air biting at his skin, carrying the scent of creosote and distant rain that might never come. Sage nickered from the corral, her breath fogging in the dawn chill. Jake fed her a handful of oats, his calloused fingers scratching her forelock. The routine grounded him, a tether in a world that had shifted since Naya's arrival. She wasn't a stranger anymore. She was a presence, a quiet force that filled the empty spaces he'd grown accustomed to. Inside, Naya stirred as the aroma of coffee filled the cabin. She sat up slowly, her ankle testing the floor with tentative pressure. The swelling had gone down, but the bruise lingered, a purple reminder of her ordeal. She met Jake's eyes as he handed her a tin mug, steam curling like smoke signals. "Morning," he said, his voice low, gravelly. She nodded, wrapping her fingers around the mug, feeling the heat seep into her palms. "The wind changed last night," she murmured, her accent weaving through the words like a canyon stream. Jake paused, listening. The wind had shifted, bringing a dryness from the east, parched and unforgiving. "Could mean drought," he replied. Sitting across from her at the scarred wooden table, they ate in silence cornbread and beans from the night before, but it wasn't the heavy quiet of solitude. It was shared, comfortable, laced with unspoken understanding. Naya broke a piece of bread, her movements precise, economical. She'd survived on less. Jake knew, and that knowledge stirred something in him. Respect, deep and unyielding. She'd escaped chains he could only imagine, crossed miles of merciless terrain on foot. He thought of his own losses to fire that had consumed his family, leaving him scorched inside. Their pains were different, but they echoed, binding them in ways words couldn't touch. After breakfast, Naya insisted on helping with chores. Her limp was faint now, but Jake watched her closely as she gathered eggs from the hen coop, her hands gentle with the fragile shells. The sun climbed higher, baking the earth, and sweat beaded on her forehead, tracing paths through the dust on her skin. She didn't complain. She adapted, her body moving with the grace of someone who'd learned to bend without breaking. Jake repaired a section of fence, his hammer striking nails with rhythmic thuds that echoed across the canyon. Naya joined him, holding the wire taut, her grip firm despite the tenderness in her ankle. "You've done this before," he observed, not a question. "In the village," she said simply. "Fences keep out more than animals." He nodded, understanding. Predators came in many forms, four-legged, two-legged, even the invisible ones like hunger and fear. As they worked, the sun beat down, the air shimmering with heat. Jake felt the burn on his neck, the salt of sweat stinging his eyes. Nea's dress clung to her, darkened with perspiration, but she pressed on. her determination a mirror to his own. By midday, they rested under the shade of a mesquite tree, sharing water from his canteen. The liquid was warm, metallic, but it quenched the thirst that clawed at their throats. Naya leaned back against the trunk, her eyes closing briefly. "The land here is harsh," she said, "but it gives if you listen." Jake wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "What does it say to you?" She opened her eyes, gazing at the distant ridges. "That survival isn't alone. The cactus shares water with the roots below. The coyote hunts with the pack." He absorbed her words, feeling their weight. He'd been alone too long, a lone wolf, scarred by loss. But with Naya, the isolation cracked, revealing vulnerabilities he'd buried. It wasn't love, not yet, not the lightning strike poets romanticized. It was forged in shared sweat, mutual respect, the kind of bond that grew from facing the unforgiving together. As the afternoon waned, Jake rode the boundary again, his rifle slung across his back. The tracks from before had faded, but unease lingered like a shadow. The desert border was a lawless edge, where men crossed lines for gold, land, or vengeance. Rumors from town whispered of raids, Apache villages, targeted by government agents and opportunists alike. Naya was free, but freedom here was fragile, easily shattered by a badge or a bullet. Returning to the cabin, he found Naya grinding herbs. In a stone mortar, the rhythmic pestle thumps filling the air with earthy scents. Sage and yucca mingled with the faint bitterness of desert lavender. She looked up, her dark eyes reading his tension. "Tracks. Gone," he said, but his tone betrayed the lie. Not gone erased by wind, but the threat remained. She set the mortar aside, wiping her hands on her dress. "They won't stop. Men like that, they claim what isn't theirs." Jake hung his hat on a peg, the leather creased from years of wear. "This land is mine. You're safe here." Her lips curved slightly, not a smile but an acknowledgement. Safe is a word for fools. "But with you, it's closer." That evening, they sat on the porch as the sun dipped, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples. The air cooled, carrying the night's chill, and Naya wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. Jake lit a lantern, its flame flickering like a heartbeat. They didn't speak much. The silence was their language, punctuated by the distant call of an owl or the rustle of nocturnal creatures. But inside Jake, conflict brewed. He glanced at Naya, her profile etched against the twilight, and felt a pulse strong, undeniable. Yet doubt gnawed at him. What right did he have to this? He'd lost Clara and Eli to flames he couldn't fight. What if he failed Naya too? The border's harshness amplified his fears, the endless thirst, the sudden storms, the men who roamed with guns and greed. His heart, once armored, now cracked open, vulnerable to loss anew. Nia sensed his turmoil. "The past haunts you," she said softly. Not looking at him, he stared at the horizon. "Fire took them. Wife, son, left me nothing but ashes." She nodded, her own ghosts stirring. "They took my family too, rifles and ropes. I ran, but the echoes follow." Their shared grief hung between them, a bridge over the chasm of isolation. Jake reached out, his hand hovering before touching hers. Her skin was cool, roughened by survival, and she didn't pull away. It was a small gesture, but in the desert's vastness, it felt monumental. Two souls anchoring each other against the wind. Days blurred into a pattern of work and quiet companionship. Naya taught Jake to identify healing plants, her fingers pointing to the subtle differences in leaves and stems. "This one eases pain," she said, crushing a leaf between her thumb and forefinger, releasing a sharp medicinal scent. He inhaled, committing it to memory. In return, he showed her how to track animals, reading prints in the sand like a story. "See the depth. Coyote, heavy with pups." She knelt beside him, her hair brushing his arm, and traced the track with her finger. The proximity sent a warmth through him, not lust but connection, built on learning, on trust earned through actions. But the external threats loomed. One morning, Jake spotted dust clouds on the horizon riders, too many for casual passers-by. He saddled Sage quickly, his heart pounding. "Stay inside," he told Naya, his voice firm. She gripped his arm, her eyes fierce. "I'm not helpless. No," he said, covering her hand with his. "But let me scout." He rode out, the sun glaring off the rocks, heat waves distorting the view. The riders were 5 strong, armed, their horses lathered from hard riding. They weren't the same men as before. but their intent was clear: bounty hunters. Perhaps drawn by whispers of an escaped Apache woman worth a reward. Jake circled wide, hidden by boulders, his rifle ready. The leader, a burly man with a weathered face and a badge pinned crookedly, reined in at the fence line. "Callahan's place," he barked to the others. "Word is he's harboring a runaway." One of the men spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Government's offering good coin for her return. Property, they say." Jake's blood boiled at the word property. Naya was no one's possession, a woman of fire and spirit. He aimed his rifle, finger on the trigger, but held back. Shooting first meant war, and the border was already a powder keg. The men probed the fence, testing for weaknesses, their voices carrying on the wind. "If she's here, we take her. Callahan's just a broken cowboy." Jake retreated quietly, his mind racing. Back at the cabin, he found Naya waiting, a knife in her hand, his knife, sharpened that morning. "How many?" she asked. "5, armed." Her face hardened, but fear flickered in her eyes, the mongrel fragility beneath her strength. "I can fight." He shook his head. "Not yet. We'll prepare." They fortified the cabin, boarding windows with spare planks, the hammer's echoes urgent. Nia loaded the rifle with steady hands, her fingers deft despite the tremor. The work bound them, closer, sweat and determination mingling. Jake caught her eye, and in that glance, respect deepened. She wasn't a damsel, she was a partner in survival. As night fell, the tension thickened. The desert cooled rapidly, stars piercing the black sky like accusations. Jake and Naya sat vigil. The lantern dimmed, sounds amplified, the crunch of gravel, the whisper of wind. Internal conflict surfaced in the quiet. Jake wrestled with guilt. Had he endangered her by keeping her here? Naya battled her own demons. Trust was a luxury she'd lost. Yet with Jake, it bloomed tentatively. A noise outside, a boot scuff on rock. Jake signaled silence, rifle raised. Nia nodded, knife ready. The door rattled, a voice hissing through the crack. "Open up, Callahan. We know she's in there." Jake's voice was steel. "Leave now." Laughter from outside, mocking. "She's ours. Hand her over, or we burn this place down." The threat ignited Jake's rage fire. Again, the destroyer. He fired a warning shot through the door, wood splintering. Chaos erupted, shouts, gunfire. Bullets thudded into walls, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the air. Naya fired back, her shots precise, born of necessity. One man yelped, hit. The attackers pressed, but Jake and Nia's defense was fierce, coordinated without words. A bottle shattered against the porch Molotov, flames licking the wood. Jake burst out, tackling the nearest man, fists flying. The fight was brutal, close quarters, dust and blood mixing. Naya emerged, knife flashing, taking down another with a swift slash. The remaining hunters fled, cursing into the night. Jake extinguished the fire, his hands blistered, coughing smoke. Nia tended his wounds, her touch gentle, eyes filled with a mix of relief and sorrow. "You fought for me," she whispered. "For us," he corrected, his voice hoarse. In the aftermath, as embers died, their bond solidified. Not in passion's heat, but in the crucible of survival. The border's cruelty had tested them, revealing strengths and vulnerabilities. Jake pulled her close, her head on his chest, heartbeat sinking. The night stretched, dangerous still, but together they faced it. Weeks passed, scars healing. Naya planted more herbs, the garden a symbol of permanence. Jake mended the cabin, each nail a vow, but whispers from town reached him: more hunters, prejudices festering. Society's norms rejected their union, a white cowboy and an Apache woman, defying boundaries. Internal storms raged. Jake dreamed of fire, waking sweat-soaked, fearing loss. Naya withdrew sometimes, haunted by captivity's ghosts, yet they talked, in hushed tones, sharing fragments of souls. One storm-swept night, lightning cracking the sky, Nia confessed, "I fear I'll bring only pain." Jake held her face, rain drumming the roof. "Pain was here before. You bring hope." Their lips met, then not in rush, but in quiet affirmation. The kiss tasted of salt and rain, a seal on their forged connection. But danger lurked. Scouts reported a larger posse forming, led by a ruthless marshal, claiming Naya as stolen goods. The border amplified the threat, facilitated, unforgiving. Jake and Nia prepared, stocking supplies, planning escape routes. Their relationship, rooted in respect and shared trials, became their strength. In the desert's harsh embrace, they found redemption, unyielding against societal chains. As riders approached, again, dust rising like a omen, Jake and Nia stood side by side, rifles ready. The conflict loomed, threatening their fragile world. But their bond, tempered in adversity, held firm, a beacon in the wilderness. The chapter continues in detail to reach approximately 5,000 words, expanding on scenes with sensory details, deepening character interactions, and building tension through conflicts. The riders crested the ridge at dawn, their silhouettes dark against the paling sky. Jake counted 7 this time, more organized, with the marshal at the front, a tall figure in a duster coat, badge gleaming like a false star. The air was thick with the promise of violence, the wind carrying the scent of horse sweat and leather. Nia stood beside Jake on the porch, her posture straight, eyes narrowed. She'd braided her hair back, practical, ready. The knife was sheathed at her belt, the rifle in her hands. "They come for blood," she said. Jake nodded, his grip tightening. "We give them dust." The marshal reined in, his horse snorting hooves, stamping. "Jake Callahan, you're harboring a fugitive. Surrender her, or face the law." Jake stepped forward, voice steady. "She's no fugitive, she's free." The marshal laughed, cold and proprietary. "Free? She's Apache, belongs to the reservation. Government says so." His eyes raked over Nia, claiming her with a gaze that made Jake's skin crawl. Nia's chin lifted, defiance burning. "I belong to no one." The men shifted, hands on guns. Tension crackled like dry lightning. Jake's mind raced, fight or flee. The cabin was defensible, but outnumbered. It was a trap. "Last chance," the marshal growled. Jake fired, the shot kicking dirt at the marshal's feet. "Turn around." Gunfire erupted, bullets whining through the air. Jake and Nia dove for cover, returning fire. The porch splintered, wood shards flying. Nia hit one rider, the man tumbling from his saddle with a cry. Smoke choked the air, the metallic temps of blood mixing with gunpowder. Jake's shoulder burned from a graze, but he pressed on, protecting Nia as she reloaded. They held the line, but the posse advanced, flames from torches threatening the dry brush. Fire again, Jake's nightmare reborn. In a desperate move, Jake signaled. "Nia." They mounted Sage and another horse, bursting from the corral, galloping into the canyon. Shots pursued them, echoing off rocks. The chase was relentless, the desert a maze of boulders and a heat rose, thirst clawed, but they rode on, Nia's knowledge guiding them to hidden paths. They lost the posse in a sandstorm, wind howling like banshees, grit stinging skin. Huddled in a cave, they bandaged wounds, shared sips of water. "You saved us," Nia said, her hand on his. "We saved each other," Jake replied. In that shelter, as storm raged, their connection deepened, intimate conversations, touches that healed. The border's cruelty had forged them, but their love, earned through fire and flight, promised endurance. Yet the threat persisted. They couldn't return. The ranch was lost. Nomads now, they pressed on, building a new life in the wilderness, their bond unbreakable against the world's harsh judgments.